We've had this theater for many years. I think I'll start from the point of when we lived in New Orleans, which was actually in 1930s. My father would come to Covington, my mother and my brother, long before the theater was built. There were many places available at that time in the Covington area, boarding houses. One in particular, I remember shooting my first BB gun, was at Lingabore Inn, which was on Military Road, right before you get to Dead Man's Curve, as we know it now. And it was operated by a family, a large boarding house. So those are some of my early memories. Also, there was a house that we lived in on 23rd Avenue here in Covington, and the streets were not paved. They were still gravel. I can recall Mr. Badon with his ice wagon pulled by a horse, and the small chips that I'd ride up and down the avenues with him. So we have roots that go way back. Although we did live in New Orleans, I think that our hearts and fondness was for the peace and quiet of the country. When we left New Orleans to travel here, we usually came in the summertime or on perhaps weekends. I can recall riding through the Chef Highway over the bridges to get here, and then later on the Watson-Williams Bridge, which was then changed to the 190 or 111 Bridge, which still remains. At that time, it had light posts on the bridge on either side, perhaps 100 feet apart, ornate cast iron light posts which were lighted. And it was during the war that those were taken down and given to the scrap drive for the metal involved. On our way here, I can recall Highway 190, and I knew that we were close to Covington when I'd see Mr. Freelander's orchard, which was an orange tree orchard, which is where New Park is now. And he had small metal pots beneath each tree, where in the wintertime he would place coals there, hundreds and hundreds of trees. So the city and town and area has changed drastically since our time here. My father was in the theater business, my grandfather, since 1908. And he developed and was the largest holder in the United Theaters. Put several theaters in and put the chain together, one of which was the Napoleon, which I believe has been torn down. The Britannia was another one. So our roots go way back. I still have some of the scrapbooks where during the silent days he would distribute the flyers, and which I have mounted in the lobby. And all of that was done for a 5-cent ticket. He had the largest neighborhood theater in the city of New Orleans up until the time the Orpheum was built. His first or second theater rather had 2,400 seats, which is a large theater by today's standards. This auditorium seats about 200 people. And he did that for 5 cents to all, or at the most 5 and 10 cents. So you can see how I reminisce about the theater business, knowing that my father and grandfather were pioneers in the business before talking pictures. We continued to come to Covington during the summer months and on weekends. My father then decided to build a summer home here on Military Road in 1937. and he had a theater in New Orleans which he sold, and this was in 1939. He decided to build a theater here in Covington. There was one operating, which was the Majestic Theater, presently where the court records are stored, and was the Hibernia Bank, about a block and a half from here. Also, at the time he announced building this theater, there was another theater announced which was cat-a-corner from the front of this building called the Deluxe Theater. So it opened before this theater, although this one was under construction. However, the war had begun and there was a shortage of steel to complete the building. Dad had to go before many war boards and so forth because the building was already 50 to 75% completed. He was granted the right to have, and I know which ones they are because they're painted differently up in the attic, the steel trusses that span the width of the building. So he opened this theater in 1942, which was an immediate success. It had 1,180 seats in the theater because it was a single screen, and the balcony was in use at that time for the colored patrons. The admission was 9 cents and 20 cents from the day it opened. Upstairs was 9 cents and 15 cents. Dad chose the 9-cent admission because he was told that had he gone to 10 cents, it would have required another tax of 1 cent, and he thought that the children should not be burdened with that, so he went to the 9-cent admission to escape that. We operated this theater as a family, and I can recall taking tickets. I know that one of the ladies in the audience, a Mrs. Hanson, brought back fond memories. Her husband was a projectionist here for more years than I can remember and taught me how to thread the machines, and I owe so much to his patience with me because I was a teenager then. The theater prospered, and about 2 years after it opened, the parties that owned the other 2 theaters approached my father and said that they would like to sell their theaters to him. A Mr. Schonberg, who operated a pharmacy here in town and was also a part of the old commercial bank, and a Mr. Warner. Dad and my grandfather purchased the other 2 theaters, and I have a brother who is 5 years older. We each operated a theater, and I can reminisce on this close to 4th of July period because in those days the theaters were packed. The seats were not more than 30 inches apart in order to allow a bigger capacity. And all theaters in town that we had were jammed, usually on July the 4th. We operated that way. My brother was called into the service first. Dad decided to sell the equipment in the theater across the street because of the tremendous shortage of theater equipment. He was approached by Mr. W. Canulet from Slidell, who Dad sold the equipment to. It was then moved to Slidell, and he opened it there. It was called the Deluxe Theater, seats and all of the theatrical equipment along with it. So this theater has had memories for me, not only on the screen, but in growing up. I went into the Navy and came back to the operation. My father operated this theater and the Majestic Theater for several years, and later sold the Majestic Theater to the commercial bank, I think at that time, who intended to use it as a downtown bank building. So along the way, the memories include various stage shows. In those days, there were regular troupes that would come along perhaps every 3 months, one of which I have the most memories with, because I was still here, a magician by the name of Willard the Wizard. And he was in his 60s, late 60s perhaps, tiny gentleman with a waxed mustache. And he came in a travel trailer, which Dad allowed him to park on a property, and he would stay for the entire winter period. My father also assisted him in getting various bookings in other theaters. Mr. Willard at one time had a tent show consisting of 17 trucks and many different types of illusions. He performed on the stage here, and at times I would assist him backstage. I could see him in the morning hours prior to the show stuffing all of the little flowers in his many tricks that he had. Hesitation, trunk, we welded him in a steel barrel. And those were some of the things that are carved in my mind as a neighborhood-friendly theater. In fact, that was my father's slogan ever since he was in the business, because we had a lady in the box office by the name of Mrs. Jarris. She was a school teacher, so she knew most of the children and also knew about when the age between the children's tickets and the adult tickets should start. So she was a fixture here, and everyone knew her. The memories of the movies are indelible on my mind. The Mrs. Minivers, that was a fine picture that I think all of us who have seen it would recall it. The Mickey Rooneys, Esther Williams. At that time, an exhibitor, as we were, could buy pictures for an entire year from a film company. They would send salesmen. Many a time, the office was on this side of the stage. After the show, Dad would stay with the salesman, and I would spend some time there for hours buying an entire year's worth of product. In those days, the product was sold what we term is on a flat basis, meaning they asked so many dollars for the pictures, and you either agreed or disagreed. The business has changed so drastically that it is no longer in the control of the theater operator. The film companies now control this business and dictate to us when we are to play a picture, how long we are to play a picture, and demand excessive, in my opinion, guarantees on the picture based on percentages of 70, 80, and perhaps 90% of the box office on certain pictures. We happen to be opening with one this coming week, Men in Black. That picture was 70% of the entire box office, and they also dictate the price of the picture. I like the old days better with the Roy Rogers and Gene Autry's that were at that time around $20 to buy from the film companies, and sometimes less. When we undertook the operation to reopen the theater. Prior to opening, which was on the same date that the theater opened 55 years ago, this past April, I called as many of the film companies as possible in order to secure or ask about shorts that could be run with the movies. No one knew where to buy a short. I wanted an old newsreel back from that time for nostalgic purposes to run with the opening feature. I then undertook, I didn't like the fact that no one could tell me where it was. I called the Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, the Academy Awards. And believe it or not, they could not steer me to anyone that could show them for theatrical exhibition. There are many of them available, but they could not be used in a theater. So I was not successful in doing that. Since we have opened, the original plan here was to operate the theater with what we call independent films, the films that are not necessarily made by the major film companies, some of which are in this country, some of which are foreign films. Some people call them art films, but the general term is independent films, whereby we would use one side of the theater for that. The other side of the theater would be for a different type of programming. I'm departing from that in the summertime with this picture that I'm playing, Men in Black. But that policy will return very shortly. The theater business is in our blood. I can only tell you that we will always operate it to the best of our ability with the product that we would be proud of showing here. And I do hope that you would tell your friends and that you would come and see us here.